thanks everybody for being here. I'm Ruth Conniff. I'm the political editor of the Progressive magazine, and it is my honor to introduce our distinguished panel to talk about prison issues. We have three extremely well-qualified people to touch on these issues. On my left is Ed Garvey. Ed has worked on prison issues here in the state of Wisconsin for many, many years. He's the editor and publisher of the political website fightingbob.com. A former political candidate, Garvey has highlighted the need for campaign finance reform, and every year in early September, as you all probably know, he puts on Fighting Bob Fest in Baraboo, Wisconsin, an outdoor gathering and celebration of progressives. Garvey's active in his private law practice in Madison, Wisconsin, where he has represented prisoners at Wisconsin's Supermax, successfully suing the state on their behalf. And in introducing Ed, I wanted to mention an Isthmus story from a year ago that talked about how Madison attorney Ed Garvey was delighted by the changes wrought by his 6-year legal odyssey on behalf of the prisoners in Wisconsin's Supermax. It could be called Wisconsin's own Abu Ghraib. But he still calls the prison, currently home to about 400 inmates, a nightmare. As Garvey sees it, the prison represents an aberration of what he considers a Wisconsin tradition. People are realizing it was a dumb idea. He says it has nothing to do with the reasons why we have prisons, and it's a very expensive bad idea. But it's one the state will have to live with for some time to come. The Boscobel prison is, in its design and architecture, a brutal place planned to deliver maximum isolation. Garvey worries that opening the prison to a more general population is just expanding the concept of putting people in a supermax setting without any ability for rehabilitation. So Ed, for years, was a chief critic of Tommy Thompson, our former governor's prison building boom, and he can talk to us about what's different now in terms of the financial and political power of the prison lobby in this state and across the nation. To my immediate right is Anne Marie Cusac, my former colleague from the Progressive magazine. Anne Marie, like Ed, is one of the most delightful, gentle, fun people you'll ever meet, who has dedicated a good part of her life to dealing with this incredibly grim issue, and I think has the unique honor of being one of the few panelists here, if not the only panelist here, who's actually been tased.
It was a stun gun.
Stun gun. So subjected to a stun gun, which she wrote about for the Progressive magazine in an award-winning story. She's won numerous journalistic awards and is the author, most recently, of the book Cruel and Unusual, The Culture of Punishment in America. And Anne Marie can address not just what's going on with the political and financial and campaign finance issues of prisons, but go a little bit deeper into the culture of punishment itself and what it is that creates in our culture this horrible undercurrent that we've seen so fully expressed over the last 10 years with torture domestically of the same type that we are hearing more and more about now internationally. So welcome, Anne Marie, and thanks for being here. And finally, to my right is Kevin Alexander Gray. He was the president of the ACLU of South Carolina for 15 years, worked for Jesse Jackson for a long time, is the host of Live from the Land of Hopes and Dreams on Sirius Satellite Radio, a contributor to The Progressive and Counterpunch. He's the author of Waiting for Lightning to Strike and Black Politics from Malcolm X to Barack Obama. And Kevin is going to address the civil liberties issues with prison reform in his own experience as the head of the ACLU in talking about these issues. And he also hastens to point out that he is a father and grandfather, and we're very lucky to have him here. So thanks for being here, all of you. And I think we're going to begin with Anne Marie.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Ruth. It's wonderful to be here. This is coming home for me. I've lived in Chicago for nearly 3 years, but I love Madison, and I love the Progressive. I wanted to start out probably by just saying a few provocative things, and then I'm going to read a couple pages from the book, a few pages from the book, which deal with the culture of punishment. But given the torture memos that came out not long ago now, and Mark Danner's effective ability to get the Red Cross report released in mid-March, I wanted to bring up a few parallels with what happens in domestic prisons. And if any of you can go on the Huffington Post and see my blog, which went up a couple days ago, and send it around to people, that would be very nice for me. But just a few days ago, I put this up, and I talk about when I heard about Abu Ghraib. Really, for me, my reaction was recognition. That is, I knew of American prisoners who had been hooded, intimidated with dogs, threatened with electrocution, shackled for days in situations where they had to defecate and urinate on themselves, sodomized with objects, exposed for long periods to intense heat, and raped by guards, all forms of treatment that allegedly occurred in Iraq. And what astonished me at that moment, back in 2004, when I was really just contemplating this book, was not the torture at Abu Ghraib, but the public shock and dismay. I didn't understand how so many people could be surprised when many of those same practices had occurred here. Well, now my book came out just in March, and in the same week that it came out, so did that Red Cross report, and which talked about things like, wrapping people in plastic cloth that had ice in it, cold water in it, and we know about the simulated drowning on the waterboard, extreme cold, things like that. Well, just to say a few provocative things here, if you look at the history of American punishment, you can actually see, now these are much longer ago examples than the ones that parallel, those that happened in Abu Ghraib, but you can actually see parallels with American domestic prisons. For instance, in the early 20th century, there was something called a water crib in Kansas, where people were placed on their stomachs, and the thing was filled with water, and it was a simulated drowning technique. And you can see, for instance, iced water inmates put in barrels in ice water. Now this is stuff that led to reforms long ago. But there was also a version of what's called the restraint chair nowadays that was invented by Benjamin Rush, one of the founding fathers of our country, and it was called the tranquilizing chair. That tranquilizing chair was pointed at as resulting in torture in an early prison here in the United States, and it was eventually banned. But it came back in the 1990s in a new form with a new maker who claimed it was humane, just as Benjamin Rush did. And we had a return to this kind of extreme restraint. And I think also when Ed Garvey talks, you'll be hearing about supermaxes, but extended solitude is also something that was practiced in early American prisons. So we do see a return of some of these older practices. But now I'm going to, after saying that, read a little bit from the book. My grandmother and I had spent hours sorting through family photographs when one of a baby in a baptismal gown silenced her. When she didn't speak, I searched for something to say and came up with the easy observation that the baby was cute. "He's a rapist," she said. From the moment my grandmother pronounced him rapist, I saw in the photo no tiny innocent in white lace, but a guilty, frightening man. Accompanying my new vision was an odd flush of disproportion. We could look at an infant and perceive the child as evil. This is a book about America. It's about sheriffs and television and God. It's about patriotism and national identity. It is about American culture, from television to religion to national politics. It is about the inspiration this country gives to many others. It is about how Americans punish. Over the past 35 years, the form of punishment in the United States has changed enormously. Our laws are harsher now. Convicts serve longer sentences than they once did for identical offenses. As a result, our prison and jail facilities are more crowded than those in other Western democracies. The numbers can startle. The United States, with 5% of the Earth's population, is home to nearly a quarter of its prisoners. Since 1973, the nation's imprisonment rate has multiplied more than 5 times, leaving the United States with both the highest such rate in the world and the largest prison system. 1% of our population is now in prison. More than 7 million Americans, or 1 in 31 adults, were either confined or on probation or parole in 2006, the last year for which statistics are available. More than 2 million inmates reside in our state and federal prisons and local jails. Another 5 million are probates or parolees. This vast system is ours at an expense, and the number I had in here is 45 billion, but it went up in March to 47 billion. The mounting prison population appears to have little connection to the decade-long drop in violent crime in this country, nor are most U.S. prisoners guilty of violence. According to 2002 figures, 19% of state felony convictions were for violent crimes, 5% of those being murder. Nonviolent crimes and actually made up 31% of the total state felonies, and burglary, fraud, and other economic crimes amounted to another 32%. As the prison population has leapt, physical treatment of the inhabitants has changed. Jails and prisons now make use of control devices that would probably have been outlawed as inhumane only decades ago, including the stun belt and the restraint chair. Some of these tools can cause significant pain. But for all these transformations and for all the popularity of tough on crime talk in the past decade, American punishment is still almost invisible, conducted in our government's private spaces rather than, as was once true, in the public square. That near invisibility of our criminals and their treatment can make it easy for the rest of us to disregard prisons. This is a book about the hazards to our communities, our families, our personal lives, and our democracy of ignoring American convicts and the methods of punishment currently employed. Many symptoms of the transformation of American punishment are not isolated in the prison cell, but can be found in our daily lives. Some ingrained cultural habits are part of this metamorphosis. They both support the new punishment and cause it to proliferate in our homes, our streets, and even our habits of thought. I am including here the shows we watch on television, the way many of us treat children, and some influential religious practices. Punishment is omnipresent and often explicitly linked to criminality in each of these arenas to an extent that was unthinkable a few decades ago. But the metamorphosis, embedded in the details of busy lives, can be difficult to recognize. And I talk a little bit about the end of a rehabilitation, a return of retribution. I actually remember the end of rehabilitation pretty well because I was a kid, and I noticed people changing the way they talked about prisoners. I'm going to say a couple things here. One is that there is a thinker named Samuel Walker, who, with a book, a classic history called Popular Justice, and one of the things he talks about is that American justice is popular. That is, this is a quote from him, the special character of American criminal justice lies in the high degree of direct and indirect popular influence over its administration, end quote. And he talks about something called delegated vigilantism. That is, when brutality occurs in prisons, and in some police brutality, that it often tends to do so when, his argument is when those people who are committing the abuse actually know that there's some support for what they're doing in the public. And that's something I think we all should think about. I certainly found evidence for it as I was writing this book. Do I have a few more minutes, or am I? Pretty much at the end of the okay. So I will pass on the mic.
Okay, we're going to move on. Each panelist will give about a 10-minute introductory statement, and then we'll start the conversation with the audience. So, Ed?
First off, Ruth, thank you very much. Former politician, or former candidate means you lost an election. So I appreciate it. I'm a recovering politician. I accepted a 12-step program. My wife is the higher authority. Anyway, I was appointed by federal judge Barbara Crabb to be the attorney for all of the inmates at our Supermax prison in Boscobel, Wisconsin. And I wasn't sure that a small law firm could take on that much responsibility. So I said first I wanted to go down into the prison to meet with the plaintiffs to see if they wanted me to represent them, because they weren't getting Clarence Darrow, since I had never handled a prison case before. The Department of Justice in Wisconsin said I couldn't meet with my clients because they were too dangerous, but that they have an articulate legal pen, and so I should communicate in writing. So we had to get a court order from Judge Crabb that we could actually go down and meet with these prisoners who were described by Governor Thompson as the worst of the worst. I mean, these are people who can't get along with any other prisoners in other prisons that were to go into Supermax prison. So we got the order, I went down there, and the first person I met, I asked him, do you mind if I ask you why you're here? And he said, yes, I drove my car after revocation of my license. So I said, well, that doesn't sound too bad. You got sent to Supermax for that? No, he said, I had sex with a guard in Green Bay. And I said, was it consensual? And he said, yes. I said, what happened? And he said, well, they said I was a threat to society. And if I'm a threat to society, he said, there are a lot more threats out there, Mr. Garvey. You should be looking for them. So here's my first case, was an individual who had been in prison for revocation of his license. Now, there are those who think that Judge Crabb asked me to represent these inmates because there were rumors that I might run for office again. TV spots of me with 350 of the worst would pretty well take care of that. But we focused our attention initially on the question of the seriously mentally ill. And just about everyone we talked to said, you can't possibly keep people in the kind of isolation that you have at Supermax prison and expect them to get better. They're just going to get worse. And so we focused on that, but there is one, I promised Matt that I would add a little bit of humor. And this was a wonderful moment. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago is not exactly friendly to the accused. It's not very friendly to anybody as far as we can tell. But we had reached agreement with the Department of Justice to provide air conditioning for all of the entire prison, because the only intake of air was from a pipe on top of a blacktop roof in Bosqueville, so we measured the temperature at about 102 degrees. And so the decision was that they would have air conditioning like the guards and the rest of the prisoners, or the rest of the management people. Well, once we reached that agreement, they changed their mind and said, the Department of Justice said, we're not going to do it, because if we do it, people in other prisons will riot in order to be sent to Bosqueville, because it would be so much more comfortable. So we went to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, not knowing what would happen. And Judge Easterbrook is extraordinarily conservative. He said to the Department of Justice, what's your argument against putting this air conditioning in? And the attorney said, prisoners will riot from all over the state in order to be sent to Bosqueville. And Easterbrook looked at him and he said, are you aware of the fact that some Supermax prisons are already air conditioned? Yes, Your Honor. Have you heard of any riots on behalf of people who want to go there? No, Your Honor. Then may we sum up the state's argument as a lot of hot air. Well, only lawyers would fully appreciate this, but the other two judges had to laugh first. And then the clerks, and then the people, and finally the whole courtroom was practically a riot as people couldn't believe what was happening. And they put the air conditioning in at Bosqueville. I think the fundamental question we have to ask is, what comes out with your visits to a Supermax prison, where they believe in total isolation, constant punishment, is who are we? I mean, isn't that what we were asking ourselves about Abu Ghraib, and now that we hear these stories about torture and stress positions and so, what have we become? My God. And quite honestly, for the president to say we're not going to follow through and prosecute those who are guilty of these heinous crimes, I think sends absolutely the wrong message to the future, as well as to the people that look to the United States for some leadership. So my friend and mentor Frank Remington at the law school was the sort of personification of the Wisconsin idea. And 15 years ago, he said to the Wisconsin legislature, you will have a choice to make. You will either have a great university system or the largest prison population in America. They made a choice, and the choice was they preferred prisons as a jobs program to funding the University of Wisconsin, and that is the kind of tragedy that I think we're faced with. Someone said earlier at one of our sessions that a budget is really a moral set of judgments as to what kind of a society we want to have. If we want to have an educated populace, we can't afford to have a prison where we're spending $35,000 to $45,000 to $55,000 per year per inmate to be housed and not rehabilitated. I mean, if there was some end in sight, some game plan that would say there's a chance that they're going to come back in better shape once they're released, it'd be one thing. But I would talk to Rotary clubs and others and say, who do you want to live next door to your parents or your children? Somebody who's been held in isolation in Supermax for 5 years without any contact with human beings, who comes out mad as hell? Or somebody who's learned a trade and can come out of prison and get a job and pay his taxes and act normally? And I think the common sense answer is obvious. They want to have the latter person, not the former. And yet the Department of Corrections, fed by the politicians who don't have the courage to say we need to have some alternative to incarceration, because they might be accused of being soft on crime, let this happen and let it get out of hand. So I hope everybody leaves here mad as hell today, and you'll call your legislator and say, this is nuts. We've got to stop spending so much money on prisons, get people out of prison earlier, the nonviolent ones as soon as possible, start acting like normal human beings and say, how would we want a member of our family treated if they made a mistake and were sent to prison? Because they are our brothers and sisters, and they should be treated as such, as members of our family. And if we don't do that, there's no hope of reforming the system in a way that will make any sense. So I hope you're mad as hell, and if you're not, I'll give you some more details later.
Thanks so much, Ed. And on to you, Kevin Alexander Gray.
It's just Kevin. The good thing about bringing up the rear is that just about everything has been said. Beyond the ACLU, I tell people the reason that I got involved in politics and organizing wasn't any kind of altruistic desire to help people. It was the politics of self-defense. I've got 3 older brothers. They've all been to jail. My father had 2 brothers. They both went to jail. I grew up in South Carolina from 1961 till now. And so I've been in just about every kind of jailhouse, courthouse, outhouse, you know, the chain gang camps. I remember going to the chain gang camps and throwing the carton of cigarettes over to the uncle who was in jail for murder. One of them, because both of them were in jail for murder. So a lot of the reason that I got into it was because there was a problem. Someone went to jail. You had to get them out. Someone was going to court. You had to find them a lawyer. Someone went to jail. You had to make sure that that family member was protected in jail. So now we're on to today and the drug war, and it's not that much different. You still see your family members and your friends and people in your community assaulted. And you know when you ride down the street, regardless of what your economic status or what your educational status, if you're black, you're liable to get stopped. And like you said, when you look at the pictures of Abu Ghraib and the dogs, well, you know any day that I go home, I'm going to see the K-9 unit roll through the neighborhood. Well, now as they do it, they take the dog out the car with the long leash without a warrant and let that dog roam around the yard. Or this idea of the Supermax prisons and the Maxi-Max prisons and prisoners going mad and family members going mad and not having anybody to protect them. And this whole idea of the black criminal, the mandingo who's going to sneak into your window and rape your wife and kill everybody in the house. And that's the stereotype of the black male, and that's been there since the beginning of this country. And so that's why I get into it. I wrote a piece for Dr. Jefferson Fish, I guess about 10 years ago, in his book, How to Legalize Drugs, called A Call for a New Anti-War Movement, where we could start talking about drug decriminalization or legalization, and to talk about how do we roll back all these drug laws and how do we at least remove that reason for the increase in the number of people going to jail. Because when they pass the Patriot Act, when they pass FISA, when they talk about terrorism in this country, it's not like they're rounding up Arab American people, they're rounding up black people and brown people. And all of a sudden, the drug laws become the new terrorism laws, and drug dealers are the new terrorists. And those are the things I'm concerned about. The idea that in a stimulus package that so much money goes to police to buy tasers, when we ought to be talking about how do we roll back this police state that exists in many black communities around the country. where when I wrote the piece out of a call for a new anti-war movement 10 years ago, 1 out of 4 black men between 16 and 24 were under some kind of criminal justice supervision, be it having to go see the probation officer or being in jail. And where does it start? It starts with the misdemeanor offense, and it works from there. It could start with disorderly conduct and work from there. So how do you roll this back? And that 10 years ago when I wrote that, it was 1 in 4, and now it's 1 in 3 between 16 and 24 that are under some kind of supervision. So as a thinking person, am I to conclude that in the next 10 years, 1 in 2 black men in America will be under some kind of criminal justice supervision? So those are the issues, and for me, it's not a matter of going over a problem of police having too much power, the drug war being out of hand. It's about what do we do at this point in time? How do we roll back? How do we talk about not just the decriminalization or legalization of marijuana, but how do we get rid of some of these ridiculous drug laws? How do we disempower the police? How do we demilitarize the police? How do we stop making every police action a SWAT action? When as a society do we start accepting police with masks over their heads? And that's all cool because we don't want the terrorists to know who they are. But it's not like they're going to some Middle Eastern country. They're going into houses and neighborhoods that, well, at least that I live in, and my family lives in, and my friends live in. So that's where I'm at with it. So what do we do in this post-racial America where everything is all good? How do we start talking about releasing the nonviolent drug offenders? How do we start the movement for amnesty for nonviolent drug offenders? And how do we end this war? How do we change the mindset, which I'm working on in my community, from thug life, which is what we call it. Now it's the grimy movement, and you know, it's a real strange occurrence now in my community and in communities across the South. Now the drug dealers have taken to going and buying surplus police cars. Do they do that up here?
Well, I'm sure they do.
They're driving the surplus Crown Victorias with police stickers on the back of them, because that's their gang. And now, if they're going to do time, and I think there's a piece that's in the the Counterpunch about the increase in police deaths. I think police deaths are up by 30%. Because if you're going to go to jail for 5 years for 5 grams of crack, if you're going to be indicted or charged with kingpin statutes every time you're arrested, then your life's going to be in danger when you come in the door. And if you're going to have a product that the only way that you can make sure that someone pays you for your product and doesn't stiff you is by the use of force and force of arms or guns, we've got to talk real down to earth about how do we roll this stuff back? How do we create a peaceful society? As I said, it starts with making the government be peaceful. Because the government's no kind of example about revenge. And this is the code of the kids. And how do we take back this whole idea of this prison culture that's for me that's ingrained in a lot of kids' mind in our community, where they feel that it's us against them, that's their gang, this is our gang. We go through this ritual, we go through the jails, we get our credibility, and we're back out on the streets. And in some cases, it's about feeding families. So I want the conversation to begin because I want to talk about the solutions to to some of these problems. To talk about how do we organize an amnesty movement? How do we talk about legalization beyond marijuana, which is, most of these kids say, well, that's, white folk wanting to legalize marijuana. That's not going to affect us on the corner. But how do we create that movement for change? So with that, I guess we can open it up for whatever you want to do.
Thank you. I think Ed wanted to make one more comment.
Yeah. In a sit-in in Jackson, Mississippi in 1961, changed my view of German Shepherds forever. as we walked past those dogs. And when you told your story, I couldn't help but remember that. Wisconsin's a very white state. But if you go to Supermax prison, something like 61% of the prisoners are black, and about 7% are Hispanic. How could that be? Not one black guard or person in the prison other than prisoners, not one. And you sort of ask yourself, can these guards be treating these people, or do they see them as animals in order to be able to do the things they do with them? And I think it's the latter, because you can't treat human beings the way people are being treated in our Supermax prisons, or the way our enemies were being treated in Abu Ghraib and so on. There has to be a mental shift, and I think we've got to get back to something else. And somebody, when we're talking about education, the former Secretary of the Department of Corrections said that something like 65% of those who are sentenced to prison can't read above the 3rd grade level. What does that go back to? What Jesse Jackson's been talking about for years, and that is you got to educate at the front end so you can save money on the back end. And we've got to do something about education and not just ignore the fact that these are the people who end up in prison.
Actually, does that not, that doesn't work.
This
Here,
one
I'll use
does.
this one.
This one does.
I'd pick up on that. I don't know if animals is exactly what's going on, but I do know that something changed in the mid-'70s when we saw a rise in, and this is according to several scholars who've noticed a rise in a rhetoric of evil that was applied to criminals, to children, actually, Generation X kids, I happen to be one of them, and to terrorists. And actually, if you go back through, for instance, you look at Newsweek, which had an article in the 70s entitled "The Criminal Mind." Some kids, it starts out. It talks about kids actually, and at the end it says, you know, maybe all the arguments about social formation are wrong. Maybe they're just wicked. The word is wicked. And you can see this happening in a number of different cultural areas at the same time that a real shift in how we think about criminals takes place. And part of what I'm arguing is that some of the laws that came in, when, you know, and you have politicians, I mean, the most recent example, I think, is Grassley saying, well, the AIG executives should just go commit suicide. I mean, they should inflict punishment on themselves. But there are many, many politicians who will do things like say, well, this is mayor of Las Vegas, well, what we should do to people who deface the highway system is take them on TV and maybe cut off the thumb. Because in old times, you know, they would execute people in the public square. So instead, we should just cut off a thumb on TV. But basically, a real sense that we should do extreme punishment to prisoners. Now, this is rhetoric, as Grassley said. It's happened many times. You have people trying to extend the death penalty, like Coburn, Oklahoma, saying that, you know, the death penalty should apply to abortionists. But my argument is that when you start thinking about these people as evil, it becomes easier to punish, and that you see a corresponding rise in the prison rate that seems, imprisonment rate, that seems dissociated from the fall in crime. You see a huge increase, in 721% increase in a span, gosh, I think it's a 20-year span on TV, in the number of news stories about murders at the same time that the murder rate was dropping significantly. So it seems quite dissociated from actual happenings as far as crime.
I'm thinking about this animals thing because I said, listen, I'm a Southerner. Now I have to tell y'all straight up, now I'm a Southerner, a black guy from the South, I have no couth, I say anything, what comes up comes out, what my mother said. And this, and this whole idea of coming from a culture that's so steeped in slavery. I mean, we fly the Confederate flag, Confederate Memorial Day. This whole idea, in South Carolina, it's all race all the time. That's the way we're constructed. And a fellow once told me, he said, you know, an enslaved African is kind of like your mule. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily hit your mule over the head. You wouldn't kill your mule. You might hit it over the head with a 2x4 to get it to do what you needed it to do. So it's when you talk about, and then when you talk about Southern culture and the Klan and the history of race and Mandingoism, as we call it, the myth of Mandingo, which I mentioned earlier, which comes from Haitian history, the Haitians overthrowing the French, and this fear that the black slave was going to come in and take over the plantation. All this stuff has always been a part of the laws and how the power structure deals with people, and how the educational structure educates people or doesn't educate people. Because in our state, only 3 out of 10 black males graduate from the public high school, only 4 out of 10 black females graduate from the public high school. So this idea of you got these people that you're miseducating or undereducating or not educating, and you have this history of, you know, these folk are not quite human but not quite animal. They're different from us. They might take our women or steal our women or might actually punish us for some of the things we've inflicted on them. All this stuff goes into the mix of how we do punishment, what is a crime, how long you're punished for the crime. So it's an interesting mix, but so it gets back to this idea of what kind of movement are we creating? How do we recreate a humanist movement in this country? And which is one of the important reasons for this conference this week, to try to get a framework over some of these problems. And for me, it's as I said, as it relates to the criminal justice system and the police system, it's a matter of disempowering those systems and taking away some of the reasons or some of the tools that people use to oppress people. And for me, the most obvious one at this point in history in the black community is obviously the drug war. That's the tool that's being used by the system right now.
Just quickly, I heard Sheriff Sherman Black was sheriff of Los Angeles County at the time, talking about how he considered enemies within the country no different from enemies outside our borders. So there really was an explicit, I mean, it's not just a metaphor. He was also talking about bringing in all these new tools, which were the less lethal weapons, but basically arming. I would suggest, and my philosophy is a little different probably, but I know there are good guards out there. The best review I've gotten so far has come from a 30-year Bureau of Prisons guard, and it's going to be published in the Professional Journal of the American Corrections Association. There are guards still dedicated to rehabilitation, but I think they're quite beleaguered. I think it's a very difficult position. I have one guard who told me that an issue of the Progressive featuring him, he served as a whistleblower, has been posted in the Sally Port of his prison, basically so other guards can see it and know who did it and can get back at him. So they're in a very tough spot. Prison guards need a lot more training, and they need different training, and the ones who abuse do not really need to be, public needs to be loud about it. The public is loud in a very different way, and that is supporting mistreatment, I would argue.